Hi, this is just a little preamble really before the main body of this video, which I shot before the first one in this series of Nightfall Diaries went up, and of course there's been responses, so I just want to respond to a couple of things. First of all, I'll apologise for looking completely wrecked with the terrible eye bags. That's because Smudge the cat is playing up at the moment, and if you haven't seen Smudge, she looks like this. Little Smudge. Little Smudge. Little Smudge. Little Smudge. So after that rare guest appearance by the science fiction cat, on to what I wanted to say. I'm aware that I'm making quite a negative comments. They're not negative, they're meant to be positive, but they're a bit downbeat and grim about and pessimistic about the future and present of SF. So I'm going to do something positive soon. I'm just going to reshoot a video about some books which I've enjoyed in the last 10 years or so. I've mentioned all of them on the channel before, but I'm aware there's a huge backlist, and even though I'm always saying, guys, watch the backlist please, then you'll see things, there's a lot of it. So I'm just going to do a little recap of things I've enjoyed. So it may be called something like the best SF novels of the 21st century or something, or my favourites from the 21st century. So we will cover all ground for those of you who've been with me from the beginning, but I apologise, and I'll try and come up with some new things to say. Also, when you're responding here, you know, by all means, you know, feel free to say whatever you like. But if you mention, say, Becky Chambers, the Murderbot series, Ernest Cline, Adrian Tchaikovsky, you know, that's okay. But they're not exactly going to sort of get really positive responses from me, because they are kind of entry-level things. They're really, really popular. We all know about them. And this channel isn't always about the tyranny of the popular, though I'm not saying the popular is always a bad thing. It can be really good. I'm quite fond of Adrian's books myself, I have to say. And I have read the Murderbot books, and I've read Becky Chambers, but the less to say about that, the better, probably. As I say, you can find that in the backlist. And really, it's just that, you know, it was interesting looking back at that first video, and obviously I showed some old books and nobody commented on them at all. But you know, maybe that's the sort of stuff you should be looking at reading. But anyway, onwards with the next installment, something positive coming up, and thanks very much for watching, especially to those of you who are new here. So you know the drill: subscribe, like, comment, super thanks, that sort of thing. And I think I'm going to wash my hair now and generally clean myself up for the day. So onwards. Sir, madam, whatever, your expectations are the problem when it comes to SF. It's your expectations, what you expect from something, rather than what it is, which are creating the difficulty. This is Stephen E. Andrews, Outlaw Bookseller, and welcome to another Nightfall Diary, where I air publicly my neurotic musings about the state of science fiction, where it's been and where it's going, which I guess is rather what Barry Malzberg's been doing for many years in his essays. So I guess, like Barry, who's older than me, I'm falling down the rabbit hole of despair. So anyway, welcome to this Nightfall Diary, and let's talk about your expectations of science fiction. Here's the thing. Everybody thinks they know what science fiction is, but a lot of the time they don't. I talk to people in my job selling books all the time, and have done for years, as I've said here many times before, and I get asked to recommend things, and sometimes people are looking and I say, do you need some help? And they're looking for things and they tell me what they like, and I ask them some questions, do the interrogative thing. And, you know, more often than not, I'll recommend the things that I'm sure will fit them, but won't essentially fit me. But sometimes, where I see a spark that they want to sort of get out of the rut, break the mold, I will occasionally recommend something to a non-genre reader, which is a genre book, you know. And more often than not, you know, some people will say, but I don't like sci-fi. And obviously I'm not a fan of that epithet, as we said. And then I say to them, but have you read 1984? And they said, oh yes, of course. Have you read Brave New World? Oh yes, of course. Have you read The Handmaid's Tale? Oh yes, of course. But that's different. And I've been through this so many times, and it's not different. What the problem is your expectation, as I say, of what science fiction is. And people's expectations are more often than not based on what they've seen on screens rather than reading the printed page. Now, this is nothing new. I've said this before, I know, but I want to go a little bit more deeply into it this time. And, you know, science fiction writing, once it started to be called science fiction, was sort of in the 1920s. So it evolved alongside the eruption of SF on screens. You know, cinema and television were new forms then. There were things like Metropolis in the 1920s. In the 1930s, you had serials like Flash Gordon, which reflected the kind of space operas that were being written by people like Doc Smith and Edmund Hamilton. They were a bit more florid and fantastical, perhaps. Sometimes they weren't. But there was a kind of zeitgeisty thing going on. Remember, the superhero was recreated in the 1930s as well. Yeah, we know there are precursors, but that really happened then as well. So things evolved alongside each other, and the magazines then were generally fairly unsophisticated. Things started to sharpen up when John W. Campbell took on Astounding, and we had films in the 1930s, SF films like Things to Come, which is a really, really good thing based on A.E. Wells' novel, a really good film. And obviously there was the war, which sort of pushed everything out the frame for a while. Then the 1950s, when social SF became a big thing through Galaxy magazine, the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, and people like Sheckley, Paul and Kornbluth, Philip K. Dick, Alfred Bester raised the bar, made things more dystopian and less sort of space oriented. You know, we had a massive wave of SF films then, particularly in the USA. You know, things like War of the Worlds, This Island Earth, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Often they were based on books. There were things in the UK like the Quatermass TV series and the film adaptations of them. So it was all evolving alongside each other. So the things are inescapable. We can't escape it. Even though we'd like people to read SF first, we all discovered it through screens, you know, as kids. I mean, I did. I think everybody watching this will have seen an SF TV show or a film before they could read. And, you know, a lot of the expectations come from that. And that's what draws us into books very often. So, but at the same time, when I talk to people and people say, oh, I don't like sci-fi, I say to them, don't judge written science fiction by what you've seen on a screen. Remember those examples? 1984, Brave New World, Handmaid's Tale, what have you. Loads of others. And people say, yeah, maybe. And sometimes they open their minds and give it a try and like it, you know. But if you look at, say, Philip K. Dick, for example, look at Blade Runner. Blade Runner wasn't a massive commercial success on release, but the critics liked it, and critics who didn't read SF liked it. So they picked up the book and they read the books and they thought, wow, this guy's a genius, Philip K. Dick. He's amazing. He's tackling all these philosophical issues, questions of what is real, what isn't, of empathy, and so on, and the way the world's going to be changed by tech, where there are beings which are indistinguishable from us and yet they're machines. Do they have rights? Are they important? Are they dangerous? All those questions. So of course, you know, he got in the back door by default. Now of course, sadly, Dick was dead then, and funnily enough, today I received in the post, because this is going to be a mini book haul as well, that's the way these things are going to pan out, a Philip K. Dick which I didn't have. Now I say I didn't have it, I do have a paperback. I've had a paperback since it was first published, which is way back in the 80s. And this is the UK hardcover first of I Hope I Shall Arrive Soon, Gollancz. And this, as you see, is the old yellow jacket. There's a lot of yellow jackets at the moment. And I was going to describe this as the last Dick collection that was published in his lifetime, but it wasn't. It was put together shortly after he died, because of course he died in 1981. And this was published in, let me see, 1985 by Doubleday and 86 in the UK. And this is a reprint, second impression, so that's fine. I'm fine with that. I can cope with that. I'd have preferred it first, but it's not that important. I just wanted a really, really nice copy of this. But perhaps it was the expectations of SF readers as well that made Philip K. Dick so special, because I recall when I first got into him, me and my friend Gary got into him. Gary got into him a bit later than me, and Gary's just about 6 months younger than me, and he's a big sort of Philip K. Dick fan. He's a big Shakespeare fan. He's going to be on the channel one day. And really, we used to talk about PKD, and even now Gary says, you know, a lot of science fiction fans say, oh, I don't like Philip K. Dick, he's weird. And what? And yeah, he is weird, but isn't science fiction supposed to be weird? Cognitive estrangement, remember I've said about that, the turning of things on their head. if science fiction isn't weird, if it's predictable, then it's not good science fiction. And that, of course, was why PKD was always saying that space fiction, space adventure fiction, wasn't SF, because there wasn't anything genuinely new in it. It was just an adventure story set in space. And I wouldn't quite go that far, because it still involves the tech and there's a paradigm shift. But it's the craft of SF rather than the art of it. It's taking a novum, a new thing that's been used before, to break the boundary, to look beyond our world. And if you don't do anything special with it, then, you know, it is rather routine. So it was those sort of traditional SF readers, the ones whose expectations were formed by what they saw on screens or in comic books, on paper, in visual media, that made them think that science fiction should be a certain way. But science fiction doesn't have to be that way. So maybe the expectations of, you know, SF readers are as much of a problem as the expectations of the mainstream readers, who won't go near something once they see science fiction written on the cover. Maybe we're the problem too. I just went through one of those media death cult things, which happens to Moyd a lot, where he always says, "Are we recording? We're okay." Because like him, I just did a thing where I rambled on for a few minutes and I hadn't pressed the right button on the camera. So, you know, Moyd, mate, I completely sympathise. I know how it feels. And obviously we've all done it. But it's quite frustrating when you're in full flow and you've done it and you're there. So again, it is the dark night of the soul in these things. But back to what I was talking about. Expectations of SF. You know, as SF readers, you know, we've got to recognize that we have expectations as well. We're just as biased as readers of general fiction. We expect certain things. We expect certain things from a mainstream novel, certain things from a crime novel. You know, we've got this categorical thinking. People say, "Oh, break down categories," but they are useful and they can provide a framework and discipline for an artist to work with. But anyway, in terms of that, are we influenced? If we are influenced by screens, this explains why. I mean, if you're reading SF and you stick to space opera, first contact, enigmatic artifacts in space or on the moon, alien invasion, if that's your preferred reading, you know, maybe it's because you've spent too much time looking at screens, and we've all done it, or maybe even comics. This visual media has affected our perception of SF. And I don't think there's any other genre. All the other genres evolved, or the subgenres of realism and fantasy evolved before we had SF and screens. So that's an interesting thing. So SF is the newest thing. It's still the newest thing. But it is broader than that, isn't it? You know, it should be broader than that. And that's when I said it's most exciting. And, you know, if you look at somebody who upturned expectations like Philip K. Dick did, even amongst science fiction readers, you know, and they didn't always respond to it well. Some people hated it. Was J.G. Ballard. And I just want to show you this. This is The Drowned World. This is the UK paperback first edition from Penguin. I got this today. I've been after one for a while. It's in really good nick. Unbroken spine, no leaning, looks nice and clean, lovely. And this dates back to 1965. The Gollancz hardcover was 63, and it was a Berkeley paperback original, I think, a year before that in the USA. And even though he'd written The Wind from Nowhere, this was kind of regarded as his first novel because he suppressed The Wind from Nowhere. And this really is an interesting one because it's got an Yves Tanguy picture on the cover. Yves Tanguy was a surrealist painter. And what Ballard did, he took the subconscious and he put it on the surface of the text. He took the subconscious, the unconscious, the things that we didn't want to talk about, and he lifted them up the surface. And that's why after his initial disaster tetralogy and loads of brilliant short stories, he moved into his urban trilogy and explored all sorts of things and developed his own sort of fiction that was Ballardian, that was SF, and yet it wasn't at the same time. Now, Ballard was very influenced by surrealism. And surrealism, of course, is the art form that drew on the unconscious, on the writings of Freud. And the idea was that if you could get these things to surface, and if painters and writers could use automatic writing methods and by dredging the imagery and their obsessions up, that they would come up with this non-representational, sort of non-figurative art that was pure unconsciousness on canvas. Very often it would be literary because it would be framed by a title, and the title would sort of set it down really. And let's see, what is this called? It's the Palace of something. Of course, it's in French, and So it's the palace of something, I'm not sure what. I should look it up, I'll put it on the screen maybe. But this is about the sort of unconscious coming to the surface. And, you know, Ballard was always referencing, particularly his early work in the prose, people like Dali and Delvaux. He loved Delvaux, Tanguay, other surrealists, and they were deeply unfashionable in the 50s and 60s. They were looked down on, they were frowned on. Things changed after that. In the late 60s and 70s, they were really cool, young people particularly. I mean, I was obsessed with the surrealists and Dada in the late 70s and early 80s, you know, because they were like punk, you know, they were like rock and roll, you know, they were rebels, outsiders, and they were pushing the envelope. It was really something. And what Ballard did was he was making statements at this point in New Worlds magazine. He was saying things like, Earth is the only truly alien planet. And, you know, inner space was more interesting in terms of SF than outer space. And we needed to look inside ourselves and see how we were being changed by the technology of the modern world, the mass media, all this new stuff, the rapid pace of change, the space age, all the tech that was coming, and that was changing us, and that we were the real subject of science fiction, not the nuts and bolts of the technology. And of course, Ballard was very keen on people like Paul and Kornbluth. I mean, even by the late 70s, when he was showering disdain on most SF, he would still say that a book like Frederick Paul's Man Plus was brilliant, and it's a pure SF novel, and it is brilliant. So if you haven't read Man Plus, do. So isn't that lovely? It's great, isn't it? I'm really pleased with that. Which brings me to the question of the term speculative fiction. Another thing I wanted to tackle within this frame of what our expectations are. And naming is, you know, is an important thing. And you know what I'm like about nomenclature. I'm a bit of a bore about it. And I do like to narrow things down and have specific meanings and correct usages for things. And people always say to me, language evolves, but usually that's a get out clause. If we talk about speculative fiction, which, as I say, is a term you've never heard me use on this channel, it's because I don't like it and I don't think it's exact enough. Now, speculative fiction was coined, I think it was way back in the 50s, it might even have been the 40s, by Robert Heinlein. And he said it's a better term than science fiction. Of course, Heinlein was an engineer, a golden age guy, you know, and he said, you know, speculative fiction is much better. And I used to like it as a term. But again, as a friend of mine once said to me, I used to work with a guy way back in the 80s, and I've been bookselling a few years, and he was a few years older than me. Great guy, and he introduced me to all sorts of books and culture, and he taught me all sorts of stuff. And you've got to be willing to listen to people who are older, because they will often deliver stuff to you and it'll blow your mind and change things for you. And he got me into music and things I never thought I'd like, and it was a really good thing. And he said to me, you know, why call it speculative fiction? All fiction is speculative. And he's absolutely right. Even the most vanilla, straight-ahead mainstream novel is speculating on events or character, even if it's not speculating on tech. It's speculating on society and where we are now, the way we live now, like the Anthony Trollope novel, great novel actually. So he made me think about that, and I thought, well, yeah, science fiction is kind of extra speculative fiction. Now, in the 60s, with New Worlds magazine, towards the end of the 60s, they started calling SF speculative fiction because Platt, Moorcock, Ballard, all these people, they felt that science fiction was an old hat label. It was bringing the wrong association to what they were doing with a modernist experimentation, with things that were set, you know, 5 minutes in the future. It wasn't the thing, dystopian things which commented directly through very thin metaphors on what was going on in society. For a while, you know, speculative fiction was what they used, and that would have influenced me, but I never used it, because this thing about all fiction being speculative, what allows the speculation is a novum, a new thing. And in our society, new things, no matter what they are scientifically explicable, because we've moved beyond magic and religion, even though people still believe in them. The scientific worldview generally blocks them out. There's some interesting arguments about how the two things can be reconciled, but that's not something I'm going to go into, because it's not my specialization, even though I've read about it and thought about it. I want to stick to science and the provable and the knowable and the scientific method, and hence science fiction. So science fiction to me is more specific than speculative fiction, because it ties things down to saying we are where we are. We can tell these stories because our frame of reference, our expectations are through science. So that's an interesting thing to challenge ourselves with as well. And we'll come back to that another time, because I want to stick to science fiction this time. So with New Wave, when the guys were calling it speculative fiction, Harlan Ellison was big on that terminology as well. You know, he really sort of pushed that envelope quite a bit too. And the New Wave focused on the soft sciences, and we see this when we try and define New Wave by talking about soft sciences, about psychology, sociology, philosophy. At best we talk about biology and genetics, but it was mostly the human sciences. And you've seen on the channel how I've talked about modernism, the contemporary, how I've talked about grand narrative and postmodernism, how we view SF historically from the Enlightenment onwards in the light of the changes in thought and thinking. So having a soft science approach in the 1960s, by which time modernism was full blown and was actually hurtling towards its end in the 1980s, is one of the few ways that things could move forward. So it was really a question of expectation when the New Wave came along and soft sciences sort of took over, but they were still sciences. And I sometimes think about psychology. Is psychology actually a science? Is it a thing? Is psychoanalysis rigorous? Is the unconscious really revealing those things? I mean, look at Freud. Freud to me seemed obsessed with sex, and he was a cocaine addict. And Jung had a very different mystical approach, you know, and then there's Lacan. And, you know, how much of a science are the soft sciences? So that's interesting. So we've got that dichotomy between science fiction, speculative fiction, but that's why I don't use speculative fiction. Tell me what you think below. I mean, you know, I am a tartar about these things, as you know, so I will stick with SF, science fiction, rather than speculative fiction, sci-fi, science fantasy. We haven't got to that, and we will get to it, I promise, because that's a thorny beast if ever there was one. But beyond that, going back to expectations, what are my expectations? What do I want? What do we want as readers? You know, I'm always on about things needing to be fresh and innovative in SF. The novum is essential to creating a paradigm shift, to bringing us into a new state of consciousness, the bucket of water in the face, something that we pick it up and read it and it shakes us and we go, wow, this is exciting, it's new. It doesn't have to be difficult to read. It comes from the concepts and the ideas. But most of the time, most of the science fiction published, the same as most books and most fiction published, is craft. It's not art. Science fiction craft is common, and this is what PKD meant about the whole idea of, you know, the space adventure not really being science fiction. It's because, you know, it's variations on a theme. And you think of the classic themes, the classic novums, time travel, AI, big dumb objects, first contact. I've already mentioned, we could go on. There's lots and lots of these things, and people call them tropes. And, you know, to a degree, they're not tropes. Tropes are, you know, a little bit smaller and more focused than that. They're more symbolic. You know, like a robot is a trope. So I guess the line between a sort of novum and a trope is worth discussing. But the word trope is kind of overused now, and you never heard it in any sort of conversation until about 5 or 6 years ago, and it's crept out of criticism into the mainstream, and it's often being used incorrectly. But that's for another time. We'll go tropey another time. So, you know, a lot of what's being published in SF, and this has always been this way as long as there's been the magazines, you know, from the magazines, paperbacks, hardcovers, there's always been craft, there's been journeyman variations on a theme. So it's not the art of SF. And, you know, I am worried now that we've run out of the new, we've run out of the novum, and I've been concerned about this for decades, and I know a lot of you are as well, but it is relative. If you're a younger reader, a lot of newness is there for you, but it isn't essentially in what's been written now. And this ties in with the last video and some of the other videos I've done recently, where people are asking questions about what do you read this now, and I don't get so many people asking me about what's happening with SF now, because I think they've twigged that I'm not reading much. And in the last Nightfall Diary I talked about this specifically. So, you know, if you're a young reader, something that's just come out, you know, might be very new to you, or it might be written in a style which is new because it's the contemporary parlance, the way people speak now rather than the way they did then. And that's weird, of course, because you're talking about the future. People will speak differently again in the future. I mean, look at Clockwork Orange, which is written in an argot, the nadsat, the teenage argot of the not too distant future, which is a slang, and you've got to work out what they're saying. That's more realistic. There's a bit of that in PKD's Time Out of Joint as well towards the end, you know. So, you know, it's out there, but it does make for difficult reading. So, you know, we need it in a language we understand. And you try and read a classic work of 18th century fiction, and it seems very long-winded, but people were actually more literate then. Fewer of them were literate, but they were more literate than we are. So, you know, our expectations are the problem. So next time you think you try something and it's not to your taste, you know, you can't like everything, but think about your expectations and what they are, and be prepared to step outside them, because that's how you discover new stuff. And sometimes things just won't work for you, and they don't work for me. So what am I doing to sort of upset my own expectations? Well, I got another couple of books today. So as you see, this is another mini book haul it turns into. And somebody who I came across, I can't think where, it might have been in a book catalogue or something online, and this is just a few weeks back, is a guy called Joel Lane. And Joel Lane died, I think, in 2013. No, he won the World Fantasy Award in 2013, and he died shortly after that. And I've vague memories of looking at his stuff before, and this is a short story collection where furnaces burn, which is described as weird fiction. It's kind of literary horror. And I was in work the other day, and a friend of mine who's very well read, who reads loads of stuff, really great guy, lots and lots of reading on his belt, he said to me, have you come across this guy? He gets talked about in the same sort of hushed tones as M. John Harrison. And I said, yeah, I was thinking about him the other day. And then funnily enough, I think it's Daniel who watches the channel. Hi, Daniel. Daniel watches the channel. He posted some stuff about Joel Lane, and I decided to pick this up today because I don't think I've read anything by him. And these are sort of weird fiction stories set around Birmingham. If you don't know the UK, Birmingham is in the Midlands, and it's, you know, the Black Country. As it used to be a very big industrial past, industrial revolution, steelworks and what have you, right the way up. And heavy metal was pretty much born in Birmingham. Black Sabbath and Judas Priest come from Birmingham, and it's environs and things. And for example, the first story in this refers to a suburb called Tipton, a town called Tipton, and the sort of narrator says about the dialect in Tipton, you know, nobody can understand it outside that. And one of the lead guitarists of Judas Priest, my favourite heavy metal band, was called Glenn Tipton. So obviously he took that. It's obviously not his real name. So Glenn Tipton, maybe it is. But so that sort of weird fiction. So I'm looking forward to that. Short stories, Joel Lane. So check it out. Maybe that's something we can discuss together. Maybe you guys will get to it before me, because as you see, my TBR is absolutely immense. And because of the channel, I'm reading really slowly. I'm spending so much time making videos and not enough actually reading. And of course, I'm rereading as well. I've started my late life rereading project big time, which I'm enjoying, but it is keeping me from new stuff. Also on that front, I decided to buy a book secondhand, which has a great modernist picture on the cover, which looks like a Picasso, but it's not. It's by somebody called Jessica Douglas Home. And this is Ivo Andrik's The Bridge on the Drina. Now, this is a Harville Secker trade paperback with a little leopard up there. Lovely. They still do some of these. They're mostly print on demand now. And I was selling this book back in the 80s, and my friend Mark, who you will have seen on the channel, he came to Hey on Why with me, he pops up now and again. He's a big fan of this book. And basically what he said to me was, if you want to understand the former Yugoslavia, Serbia, Bosnia, Kosovo, Croatia, you have to read this book. And I've recommended Andrik's work to people many times, using that as a sort of reason why you shouldn't. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature. This was written way back, I think this is in the 1940s. Let's have a look. He was born in 1892, and let's see, he won the Nobel in 61, and this was published in 1945 at the end of the war. And I thought I'd pick it up because it was £3 and it's pristine, and I've meant to read Andrik for years. So there you go. This is a cheat. You see, I know about this stuff because I work with somebody who read it, and you soak it all up from each other. And that's how booksellers work. That's how you build your knowledge. Aside from your own reading, you go outside your expectations, you listen to what your mates are saying, and you pick up loads of stuff, and it's really, really good. And that's the joy of a good bookshop, and that's the joy of working with other people who really love books, you know, and you're with them sort of 7-8 hours a day, you know, 5 days a week. I don't do that anymore. I'm part-time now, but you know, it's great. And the trouble is, you end up with the longest TBR in the world, and you're like a kid in a sweet shop. So I'll have a go at that at some point. Maybe that'll turn my expectations as well. I am getting into the idea of reading history because I'm working with history books again extensively now for the first time in a long time. So we'll see what comes out of that. And, you know, maybe this will turn into a history channel. Oh no, I hear you cry. I know Matt Defoe at Science Fiction Reads likes history. So that's today's mini haul. Philip K. Dick, I hope I shall arrive soon. There's some great stuff in there. Ballard's Drowned World. Slightly peeved that this isn't a first, but I can cope. I haven't got many reprints, but isn't that beautiful? I just wanted a nice copy, and it's uncommon and good nick. Joel Lane's Where Furnaces Burn. I'll tell you a bit more about this. Episodes from the casebook of a police officer in the West Midlands. A young woman needs help in finding the buried pieces of her lover so he can return to waking life. Resurrection. Why do local youths keep starting fires in the ashwoods around a disused mine in the Black Country? A series of inexplicable deaths uncover a secret cult of machine worship. That's the thing, the landscape, the industrial landscape, and this is something M. John's big on in things like the Vericonian books, which are set, you know, in the Midlands pretty much, in a future Midlands, or is it the future, or is it the past? Who can tell? You know, there's a lot of sort of room in this, and this will tie into psychogeography and urban spaces and urban exploration. And on that front, I just want to mention briefly a book which I don't have to hand. There's a guy called T.M. Hill, and there's a really interesting urbex SF novel by him. I'll flash it up at the end of the video. Anyway, the Dark Night of the Soul goes on, but I think it's probably time for pizza now. That'll bring me round. Bye for now.